Okay, so welcome everyone to the PEP Special Interest Group seminar. I'm just going to introduce the PEP seminar series very quickly and then introduce our guest speaker for today. So the point of the seminars is to bring together people who are interested in various aspects of professional education and the partnerships that sustain professional education. So that's working in the university and working in the broader partnerships in and around London. And it's working in teacher education, but it's also working more broadly in professional education across health and various kind of social disciplines. So that's what we're about. And I'm really pleased today that we've got GORANA, who is the kind of one of the perfect representatives of that partnership approach, who is working in schools, but has studied with Middlesex and is sharing some insights from her practice, but gathered as a practice or practitioner researcher. So she's bringing together loads of fields of interest and bringing that knowledge back to us as a partnership of people within and outside of academia. So I'm really pleased to have a practitioner sharing their practitioner research. And I'm just going to say, keep checking the website for future events, because this is the kind of thing that we're trying to do and bring people together. GORANA is going to present for about 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. So I'm going to mute myself and hand straight over to GORANA to give a proper introduction.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lee. I'm just going to share my screen. Lee, my sharing is disabled. Is it possible you could see if you can allow? While Lee's doing that,
I think I've released it from my end. So if you try again, you should be able to
yes, great. So let's have a look. Lovely. Hopefully everybody can see that. Yeah. From the beginning.
Yeah, that looks good.
Perfect. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here and welcome. So my aim for today is just to share with you, as Lee said, a research project that I did. It was part of my work with Middlesex for my master's degree, but what was really great is that I work in a school. I'm a deputy head teacher at Wessex Gardens Primary School, and I was able to do this with some wonderful colleagues as well, who really, you know, devoted a lot of time and learning into this as well. So as a school, I feel like we've really benefited, and I hope it will inspire you as well to, if you're new to this approach, to have more of a look into it as well. So I think between us in education, we know that the statistics on speech, children's speech, language and communication needs are staggering. We know that there's a big word gap between children who are disadvantaged and their non-disadvantaged counterparts. So this study looked at to what extent opportunities for children's storytelling and story acting would support the development of speaking in early childhood. Just a little context with regards to our school, so you know who we are and how we worked. So a larger than average two-form entry primary school in Northwest London. Our pupils come from considerably wide range of backgrounds. Our mobility is very high, so we have about 30% of pupils who leave or arrive throughout the year. And then a large number of families who arrive during the academic year are new to English. So our overall English as an additional language population is about 88%. In addition to that, we have about 20% of our children that have special educational needs, and about half of those are considered to be disadvantaged as well. And then in terms of our overall disadvantaged population, it's just under a third of the cohort. We're an incredibly a cohesive community. We're very fun-loving. We like innovation. So this was the perfect kind of blend of a, I guess, a setup for us to try something new. You will be seeing these little snippets of stories that children have told over time. So that's what they are, just so you know. Okay, before I go on, I'll just define the speaking, because you'll see it's capitalized, the word speaking. So Many of you might be familiar with what that means, but some of you may not. So speaking is a strand of the communication and language area of learning in the early years. This study was done between spring 2019 and spring 2020. We just kind of clipped the first lockdown, so that's when it stopped. At the time, we were working with the 2017 Early Years Framework, and the definition of the early learning goal for speaking was that children express themselves effectively, showing awareness of listeners' needs, that they use past, present, and future forms accurately when talking about events that have happened or are to happen in the future, and that they've developed their own narratives and explanations by connecting ideas of or events. In the new framework that's just come out this year, a lot of this continues, but there's just more of an emphasis on interactions between children and adults. So, you know, it's still very, what we're going to be talking about is still very relevant for the new framework as well. So the aims of our study, basically going through our, self-evaluation, we identified that actually in our early years, data did show that communication and language needs to be a huge priority. In both our nursery and reception cohorts, a significant number of children were coming in with low attainment on entry, but particularly in speaking. So we were looking to develop a low-cost, high-impact practice that would support the development of young children speaking, and so laying the foundations for their further education. We know that children learn and develop from birth to 5 more than at any other point in their lives. So hence, this is the reason why, you know, we need to just try and support them to narrow or close the gaps when they are very young. So in wishing to do this, we were looking for an approach that would be inclusive for the children, that would motivate our boys, because we were having a big focus on the progress of our boys and disadvantaged pupils, that would brought in experiences of language for pupils with English as additional language, with SEND, and who are disadvantaged, that would not add to teacher workload, that would put children at the center, and then that would be sustainable. So it's not like a one-hit wonder, but something that we could continue to work with. We also wanted something that wasn't just an add-on, so just do this, but you know, there's we're not sure if there's a link or not to the earliest framework, which this link formed a part of the study, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we wanted to enhance existing good practice, because we did have a lot of good practice in terms of adult and child interactions and modeling and so on. But we were aware that, you know, if something needed, there needed to be a bit of a shift, and this approach was a perfect opportunity to see whether that would help with our shift. So a chosen approach is an approach that was piloted by this lady here. Her name is Vivian Gussin-Paley. She was an American kindergarten teacher and wrote extensively about the way children learn and their interactions. And what's quite special about her books, which she has written quite a number, is that she really captures the dialogue between herself and the children, because what she would do is she would use her dictaphone and record herself, and while you know, the interactions were still fresh in her mind, and so she was able to really closely document the impact of this approach on the children and their development, and you know, both their personal and their social development as well. In addition to that, this book here, there's a practitioner, a current practitioner called Tricia Lee. She's actually UK based. I believe she briefly worked with Vivian Gussin-Paley, and Vivian Gussin-Paley wrote a foreword in this book, and this has basically served as a guide of how to implement this approach in your classroom. So I'll talk again, mention this a little bit later as well. So the way this approach works is that children volunteer to tell a story. So you might say, okay, we'd like to tell a story today, and then the practitioner scribes the story. So the child will tell it, and it's scribed verbatim. So exactly how the child says it, we write it down. And then after that, there's an area of the classroom that is just taped off as a stage, and children sit around, and then the practitioner reads the child's story. The child will come up to the stage and act out the part that they've chosen. And also, if there are any other characters appearing, children around the stage would be invited to come up to the stage and join in. And sometimes there's like whole audience participation as well. And the initial benefits to us were that it's low cost, that it can be done within the setting, that it was easy to introduce, and that it was going to be very inclusive. So the design of the study was that we had a team of 4 teachers take part. So that was, as I mentioned, over 3 terms, 2 academic years, so spring 2019 to spring 2020. And we ran weekly sessions in each class. So once a week,
I've done this.
Each class would have a practitioner that would scribe the stories, and the children would act them out. The children were free to initiate and tell a story on any topic of their choice, and that would be even gunplay, violence, and death. We had a big conversation in school with our earliest leader and our SLT around, what happens if. So we were, in looking at what are the potential risks of this, or what might come up. We're thinking, okay, do we allow this? If there is some violence in the children's stories or gunplay. And what highly influenced the decision that were made is this article, and I'd highly recommend it if anybody is having a similar question within their setting, is this bang bang gunplay and why children need it. Really some strong arguments for allowing the children to explore the world that they live in through, ultimately through play, but through stories as well. This book, again, this Princesses, Dragons and Helicopter Stories, we used it as our guide. And crucially, I developed a scaling scoring system to measure the progress of children speaking, because if we were going to use this approach, I wanted to know how relevant is it to the framework. I wanted to almost kind of prove that it's not an add-on. It's, it's going to have some relevance to us, and we can use it to enhance practice towards the children achieving their early learning goals. So you can see down here what sort of sample size we were working with, and I did mention our high mobility. So a total of 271 stories were collected, but in the final sample we had 169. That was due to some of our nursery children leaving to go to different schools for reception. And again, lots of our families moving as well. And we had, so the final sample had stories from 14 nursery children who moved into reception, and 26 reception children who then moved into year 1 as we continued. Okay, so this scale and scoring system was like a merger of different things. So in looking at what research was available around this storytelling approach, I came across lots of different things that practitioners had and researchers had looked at. So for example, multimodality, so children's nonverbal communication and how that might influence stories, or things like children's narrative development in particular. So there was a researcher, a lady called Angeliki Nikolopoulou. She devised a system of to measure the progress in children's narrative development. So I used that as a base. So that's anything blue that you see. This is what she was looking at in terms of narrative development. Because our children were dealing with stories or narratives, it made sense to keep some of that and build on that. Then I built in all the, so from the Development Matters framework, so the guidance on, steps to achieve early learning goals, they were built in. So for example, for vocabulary, you had a progressive set of statements that would support us to attribute this scoring system. So we had scores 1 to 5 for each of these areas. So we looked at vocabulary development, we looked at whether children's linking statements would improve, so like their connectors. We looked at whether children's use of tenses would improve. We looked at whether children's oral sentence structure and the number of clauses containing a subject and a verb would improve. We looked at the children's awareness of the listener. This is an interesting one. And the reason it was interesting is because within the guidance, awareness of the listener only comes in very late. So when children are in reception year, and it's to show some awareness of the listener. But actually children as young as, our nursery children were showing awareness of the listener. So we had then built in some additional descriptors for different areas, so to plug the gaps basically, and areas where we thought that we were seeing evidence of this, but maybe there was not anything in the guidance. Or when we took an initial sample of stories, we trialed this scale and scoring system, and we noticed that it didn't account for some aspects that we were seeing. So for example, the number of clauses we put in as well. So it allowed us just to tailor it to any eventuality that we would encounter, just to see how the children's stories would perform against the framework in effect, because that was the basis for this system. The type of data that was collected, we had the children's pseudonyms, their gender, whether they were classed as disadvantaged or not, whether they had any additional needs, and whether they were new to English. We then looked at each child's story. So every story was scored according to the system. So we would look at each aspect and score each aspect on a scale of 1 to 5, and then tally that up to a total of 30. This here was going to be the main basis of the research. However, we also kept an eye on things like creativity. So whether, for example, children who were disadvantaged would show any more or less creativity than their non-disadvantaged counterparts. We looked at story beginnings, so the way the children were starting the story, so whether there was more traditional story starters like Once Upon a Time, or One Day, or whether stories just sort of started anywhere. We looked at whether children were using any problems at a young age within their stories, whether they were including any conflicts, whether, just on the back of our discussion on violence, what proportion of the stories did actually include violence, and was that significant or not. We looked at story endings, so whether there would be anything significant about, at what stage children start to create resolution to their stories. So whether, you might have, and then they all went home, or whether it would just kind of sometimes end in, and he jumped really high, or something that would indicate that there would be more to come, and also whether the child would indicate where their story is finished as well. Another bit of data that was collected was to do with what types of characters and settings the children chose to use. So this was collected just to again look at, were there any differences between boys or girls, or children who were disadvantaged or not disadvantaged, in terms of the types of settings, the range, I guess, in terms of the range of settings that they were using, or the range of characters. So what was quite interesting is that in both cohorts, characters which were explored within the setting, so here we've got monsters, dragons and dinosaurs, and again, princesses, kings, queens, and knights. Those were the most common in both cohorts, and this mirrored, the fact that children had their settings turned into, their role play was a castle, and they were exploring stories around kings and queens and knights and so on. So that did heavily feature here, and in the other cohort, we've got our princesses, kings, queens, and knights quite close behind. And then in both cohorts as well, the house or home was the most common setting that the children chose to use as well. So in terms of the results, so boys and girls, we were looking, because at the beginning I said we were looking at our boys in particular, and was this approach going to improve their speaking? So in our first cohort, so that was our nursery children moving into reception, I looked at the average scores for boys and girls, and there girls pretty much had higher average scores, I think here for every area. However, when we looked at the average improvement for the same cohort, there were definitely areas where boys showed a more rapid improvement. So for example, in terms of connectors, so the girls may already have been high up there with their connectors, but the boys, with the accelerated improvement, there was an indication that, the approach could support the development of this aspect of their speaking. Similarly, with their tenses, they showed a good improvement. The number of clauses that they were using as well. And so their overall improvement was a little bit higher than that of the girls. And this was mirrored in the second cohort. So these were reception children who were going into year 1. And for them, the average scores of girls and boys. So again, on average, the girls scored higher. However, in terms of improvement here as well, a little bit higher for boys in vocabulary, again in their use of connectors, and again quite a bit in their temporality. Number of clauses was the same, but the awareness of the listener, what we found with the boys in particular is they tapped into the fact that you can make your friends really laugh with this approach, and they really responded well to the opportunity to tell their stories, because they wanted their friends to, have extreme reactions to their stories. So that was really lovely. They're organizing a sequencing as well a little bit, so again resulting in higher overall improvement for the boys. And for our disadvantaged pupils, just bearing in mind that it was quite a small sample size for the disadvantaged pupils. So there was just one nursery child and 6 reception children. So looking at them as a whole kind of cohort of disadvantaged pupils across both groups, we could see here that in terms of vocabulary, the disadvantaged pupils did have a little bit of a lower average score on average, which sort of mirrors that national picture. However, for some of the other areas, they seem to be on par. And then the most significant improvement here for our disadvantaged pupils was around temporality, so their use of tenses and the consistency in their use of tenses mostly. As well as this hard data, if you like, we looked at how to measure creativity. So yes, one aspect I mentioned was around, would there be a difference between the creativity of our disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged pupils? But also, can creativity be developed? Is it something that the children just have? Is it something that's, going to be impacted upon by this approach? So it was very difficult to find some really in-depth research about creativity and children. So lots of researchers wrote extensively about creativity in adults. But the one thing that I found that was going to be really relevant, I felt, to our children was from Plucker and Bogato here, and they defined creativity as a measure of this little c and big C creativity. So what that meant was that something with little c creativity would mean that a child would take something known to them, so maybe a story or something they'd experienced, and they'd use aspects of known things to sort of merge them and come up with something new. The big C creativity would be something completely new, something completely novel, something that the listener hadn't heard before. So I'll give you a couple of examples from our story samples. So an example of little c creativity from this child was, once upon a time, there was a princess. She was so beautiful, and she was walking in the woods until she saw 3 little bears, and the bears was friendly. But the princess was scared of bears, and then she ran out of the forest until she got back in the town. That's all. So this child here merged her interest in princesses. She was very passionate about everything that was to do with princesses, and the story of the Goldilocks, which the children were reading that week. So she took the 3 little bears and her princess and created a story around that, and used some of the settings there as well. So that was considered little c creativity. An example of big C creativity was from one of our children, one of our boys actually, who really wanted to create a story that would make his friends laugh. And he was really thinking on the spot and trying to come up with something completely, something completely new that they hadn't heard before. So this is what we had. So once upon a time, there was someone called Mr. Bally Ball. He didn't like his family because his family were rotten balls. Bally Ball just broke his house, and then he ran away to a different house. Then he can poop how much he wanted. So he was looking for effect here. And yeah, I think he got it when he performed his story. I think he achieved his intended outcome. So that was an example of big C creativity. That was just from scratch. And then an example of no creativity was just any pure recount. So something children had learned and just recounted, or something that had happened and they just recounted it. So for example, dinosaur, they eat meat, they eat people, they eat trees, they eat wood, they eat grass. So we looked at these types of creativity. So for each story, basically, it was classed as little c creativity, big C creativity, or no creativity. So we could see that most of the stories were little c creativity, which is what we expected. It was children listening to each other's stories, incorporating, some of their favorite characters, maybe from cartoons, from games, from stories, from things they'd made up with their friends, and crafting their stories from that. We had no big C stories at all in nursery, and then in reception we did, so there was a total of 5 from the whole sample. And then some children did choose to recount some experiences or stories, or some of their learning as well. There was, what we did find with our disadvantaged cohort is that there was quite a number of them who were very repetitive in their settings. So for example, a child in particular, she would be very enthusiastic to tell her story. Every week she would volunteer, and when it would come to her time, it would almost be the same story. So it would be Elsa and Anna, and it would be them waking up, brushing their teeth, going to school. So exactly kind of recounting what she would experience in her day. So that was a really interesting thing to kind of to get from this, to see that, okay, we do know that we need to broaden the experiences of our disadvantaged pupils, but you could see it manifest, and you could see it manifest as almost like a limitation of, when they wanted to use particular language to extend their story and so on, that there was a bit of a limitation there. One wonderful thing that we observed here, the impact on our boys, was that there was a particular day when there were 4 boys and they wanted desperately to tell their story, but you can only fit so many within the day. So they got a bit grumpy, the teacher said, and she carried on taking other children's stories and so on. And when she'd finished, they'd come to her and they showed her what they'd done. So basically, they had mirrored the practice of scribing the story, just completely on their own, so completely self-initiated. They had gathered around the tough tray, which had like some little small world bits and pieces, and they one of them scribed the story and the others told the story. So the story was, once upon a time there was a butterfly. The rabbits are sick and they need to stay home. The spider eats the butterfly. The other butterfly attacked the spider. The spider died. The end. So that was just so wonderful to see children actually, initiating this, and to see the impact of the approach on writing. So, we're so focused on developing speaking, but actually, children were watching so closely every week when the practitioner would scribe and pause and, write a capital letter and a full stop, that they could really see them starting to initiate their own writing. And so this started something else. It started some storytelling using some small world play as well. So again, there were some children that made another story using some small world resources. The teacher was there to scribe this one, and then she typed it up and took pictures of the children's story, and then made it into a little book that went into their book corner. So that was really lovely. Another observation here, sorry, I'm not expecting you to see this writing at all. It's just kind of here to help me explain to you what happened here. But this was the impact on one of our children with speech and language difficulties. And this child was a very reluctant speaker. He would communicate, using gestures and his body language, and he would talk, but it's not something that he wouldn't initiate it and play with other children and so on. So he spent a lot of time observing to begin with, and the way that he became really interested in the approach was when he was chosen to be one of the children who acted in another child's story, and he was a big motorbike. So the child who told the story, it was all about old MacDonald, and the bit there, the child said that there was a big motorbike, and credit to his teacher, because when she read there was a big motorbike, he really, just came alive acting out this big motorbike. And so the following week, he actually did want to tell a story, and he related it to what he had experienced. So we had Old MacDonald, and it's circled because he wanted to act out the part of Old MacDonald. Old MacDonald had a farm. So, and then he used that big word that really inspired him. So we had a big pig, a big cow, and a big, big, big carrot and apple. He went to another boy by car and open it and open another thing. So that was really lovely evidence of him just, taking something he had experienced and putting it in there. And then it was a long little while before he told another story. I think there's a gap of about 3 months here. But what happened here is that the child, because we had like a story table, this was in nursery. So there was a story table where the practitioner would take the stories, but children could sit around the table and then could draw or cut and do little bits and pieces. But he always chose to sit there when it was story time, and he would really be listening. You could sort of see him looking over, he'd be coloring, but listening. And the week that he told this other story, we had children really interested in telling stories when somebody would eat someone. So we had a child saying that dinosaur would eat you again and again, and on the same day. There was another child that said a dinosaur wanted to eat a princess. Then we had a dinosaur eating everyone, and then we had a dragon eating people, and there was Spider-Man included in some of this, and so on. So just having listened to all of that, this child came up with Spider-Man was eating a daddy. He came and ate the mummy. He eat, so that was his name. His pseudonym was Gamma. And Spider-Man eat you, he said to his teacher. and he called his friend's name as well. And then in the end, we had hedgehog died as well. So he really, comes back to the bit where I said, you know, taking into account the you know, awareness of the listener. He was really looking at his teacher's reaction when he said, and the Spider-Man eat you. So I think he was trying to get some effect going on in there. Another observation we made was that there were some one-word stories typically told by children who were either new to English or with speech and language delay. And just to show you briefly, this is how a child started. So his first story was T-Rex. We thought, okay, T-Rex, what's going to happen? But actually there was an observation scribed here that he had a whole story in his head about what that T-Rex was going to do. So there were no words in his acting at all, but he growled and he went around the stage and he went close to his friend and he had claws, and this T-Rex, you know, had a clear plan of what he was going to be doing around the stage. And then a month later, the same child starts expanding his story. So we had Spider-Man shoots webs on bad guys, it's Venom, he died. And then some further development as well, sorry. So the T-Rex and Crush, the championship guy, killed Triceratops, volcano erupted, and the dinosaurs died. So you can see kind of his progress in his storytelling there. The approach, you know, continued into year one with that one cohort, but actually I followed that cohort into year two just for fun. So outside of the research project, they just really craved it, and they're in year three now, and it's not very often that I'll walk past without them asking, you know, when are we doing the stories? So something very clearly that they're passionate about, something that they have to, you know, there's such a lot to say right from a young age. In addition, there were improvements in listening and attention, confidence, children's imagination, interest in writing, boys' engagements. And this is like a little excerpt from my, just from the study. And it said, what has been obvious to the whole team is how intently children listen to each other's stories, even those deemed to still be developing their listening and attention. There is a hush and anticipation, a great respect, and an overwhelming hunger to hear each other's stories. This is very obviously a powerful tool, which if harnessed and steered effectively can yield great results. And, you know, as a practitioner, it's those times when there's that bit of magic, when you see that, you know, that it's, you know, it's often children that have that wonder and awe about the world, but as adults, you know, that there are these special times that we have it, you know, we get back to, and this is one of those times when, you know, you can just look and think, oh my goodness, you know, there's something very, very special happening here. So in terms of reliability and validity, so the children hear you scribing, so you have to speak back to the child at every stage of each sentence and read the stories back to them, and they will often correct you if you've got something wrong. There were some professional logs as well that documented their acting out, and the scoring of the stories could be verified by looking back, cross-referencing back to the stories. And then we had some colleagues independent of the team who moderated some of our scoring as well. Some of the limitations was that can't say this is the effect of this approach alone, because you know, this was not the only approach that was being used at the time to develop children's communication and language. So you know, it can contribute to the improvement, I would say. In terms of temporality, there was a low score for children using consistent present tense, and I think that probably should not have happened. So if I were to do it again, I would probably allow if there's a consistency in tense, because some stories are very effectively told in consistent present tense, and I think it carried a score of about 2. So that may have limited some children in terms of their scoring. Another limitation obviously is the small sample size, and not a limitation, but we had within the team a debate of whether, you know, how far does the practitioner get involved in mirroring the language used correctly. So for example, the correct use of tenses or the correct use of grammar and so on. So we kept true to the approach, just you know, because too many variables would not have been good. But it would be interesting, I think, to look at what the impact would be if the practitioner, on hearing the child, you know, engage with the child and mirrored back to them the correct way of saying something on the spot, whether that would put the child off, which was one of the arguments, or they may not want to return and so on. So the danger was that it would just become too heavily guided, and we didn't want that. So but it is a debate to be had, I think. I'm going to skip these conclusions because I think we talked about it, and I do have a slide here for if anybody, you know, wanted to try. I've got some tips as well, but again, I'm conscious of the time, and I've got some recommendations, or if you wanted to look at some research around this approach, I would really recommend this book and a couple of Vivian Gustin Paley's books as well. But I think probably what we should do, Lee, is just go and see if there are any questions. I think I've gone slightly over my time now.
Okay, thank you. Really lovely presentation, and I think it's probably worth taking the extra time to work through some of those details. It's where the project comes alive, isn't it? So
yeah,
no one's posted any comments yet, but everyone is still here, so I know they've been listening. So over to you. Either post something in the chat if you've got a quick question or a comment or a response, or just unmute yourself and shout it out.
Hi, I'm interested in the debate that you had about modelling language. What
Yes.
sort of things were the practitioners saying?
Okay, great, thank you. So what we were saying is, normally when we interact with the children, you know, if a child would say something that was, you know, that we could then mirror back correctly to them, we would do that. So the debate was around, do we do this while they're telling us their story? And the arguments for and against, the argument for was that yes, we should, because it could potentially help to accelerate their progress if we are just working with them there on the spot, you know, and they could repeat it after us and so on. And the argument against was that, you know, would there be a danger of the practitioners just getting too hooked on corrections rather than actually listening to what the children were saying? So what we did do is we scribed them completely verbatim, but then when the practitioner was reading the story to the whole group, the practitioner would read it in standard, in a sort of correct English, in standard English. So I felt like we had a bit of a balance of both, so it wasn't on the spot, but yes, that was what the debate centered around.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. There's a question from Kerry. How long would a session be?
Okay, so the scribing, so we worked out that hearing about 5 to 6 children tell their story, it takes, I would say, about half an hour, 40 minutes tops, just sometimes allowing for children's thinking time, because some children will have told us that they're actually, you know, I've been carrying this story around, I need to tell it, and it was almost like I need to get this out. So they knew straight away what they wanted to do. Whereas other children just wanted to tell a story, would get there and would go, oh, you know, and so that sometimes takes a little bit of time. So while that's happening, you know, the class can be in session, so it doesn't really impact on anybody else. You know, it's just what we usually do is say, okay, who would like to tell a story today? There would normally be a list, and then call the children one by one. Others can be playing alongside. They actually really like to listen and look at what's going on. So that takes about, 30 to 40 minutes maximum. And then where we used to do the acting bit is usually at the end of the day, or at the end of the session if it was a nursery. So that would take us about 20 minutes. depending on the length of the stories. As children got older, so in year 2, the stories did become a little bit more longer, a bit more complex as well. So it might take about half an hour, but I'll say, yeah, about 30-40 minutes scribing, and then about 20-25 minutes to act out during that day. Thank you, Kerry.
Okay, Gazla's asked a question, which is just the technicalities of this, so I'll fill in a gap while other people are thinking of questions they want to ask GORANA. We will post the recording on the SIRS website. So I'll email everyone who pre-registered via Eventbrite to tell them when it's up. But also, if you don't already know where it is, if you just search for MDX SIRS, CERS, you can find all of the previous presentations from the PEP seminars, but also we have a childhood and society special interest group where we have lots of different people presenting on different aspects of childhood and early years practice. And Paula's on the call today, and she oversees a work-based learning SIG and conference series. Okay, any other quick questions? Well, we've got a few minutes.
Maybe just
I'm interested, GORANA, unless anyone else is going to jump in, I'll ask just a general question about how much of this survives now the project's finished and you're free of the masters. What lives on now? You don't have to do it so formally?
Well, actually, we've restarted the helicopter stories in our reception this term, thanks to our lovely team who really believe in the approach and can really see the benefits. So I think we've had obviously the pandemic and so on. So we was, as everybody else, was stopping and starting. But what we found in the early years is that autumn term, it's great to let the children just settle for that term. And then in spring term, it's the ideal time to start the approach. So we are continuing because it doesn't, the most, I guess, for us is the biggest constraint is, how do you, it's the adults in the room. How do you dedicate that one adult, and when do we do it? Because it takes them out of action, so it's managing that. But again, it's not for a very long time. So for some of the time during the study, I went in and took those stories. And they really, they do have a place in Key Stage 1 as well. I will say that, just having worked with the children there. But if anybody's thinking of having a go, I would just recommend really getting this book. It's like a, it's like a guide. It just guides you through setting it up. It's immediate. In the first session that you have with the children, it guides you through how to explain it. And children, they get it quite quickly, really, and you're off. You just need a type of notebook to scribe in. If you need some masking tape to mask off a stage, you need an adult or a volunteer for 30 to 40 minutes once a week, and a slot for the stories to be performed. And it really is a little bit of magic on lots of different what word am I looking for? For lots of different areas. And thinking about the framework as well, you've got maths in there, because the children have to tell you, okay, there are some baddies in the story. Okay, how many baddies would you like to come up to the stage? And then the children might say 20. Oh, our stage is a little bit too small for 20. So, let's have another try. So, there's lots of different, personal, social, emotional development, the physical development, because some children, the way they move when they're acting is absolutely incredible. Communication and language goes without saying. The literacy aspect, the impact on writing, understanding of the world, and just expressive arts as well. It's just like all encompassing. It's just it's really good.
Thanks. And now this always happens towards the end. People start coming up with their questions. So I'm going to give you 2, and you can pick which one you respond to. So one is an easy one. It's kind of, what were you surprised by in your findings, if anything? And the other one you might want to kind of mull over while you're telling us that answer is, Paula's asked about this notion of the audience and listening. So we've tended to focus, in the way you've told us, about the coming up with your stories and presenting. I wonder what your thoughts are about the children's experience of being in the audience and listening. So you can pick either one of those.
Lovely. So maybe just in order, can we do both? Can we do both? Yeah. Okay. So the first one about what surprised me. One of the things was unconscious bias, actually, that surprised me there. It was something, you know, as you know, experienced practitioners, you think you know about it, and you know you are aware and so on, but it was actually how complex some of the stories were of children who could only you know, communicate in very simple terms using words. So things like, you know, our one-word stories, for example, and the acting that went into that. Also, some assumptions. So there was a child that told his story, and he said, so I'm going to use a different name. So he said, John London Bus. He was new to English. His family had just moved to London, and I was actually scribing that story. So I saw the story, John London Bus, and I assumed, oh, he's been out with his family and he saw a double decker, and I was already had this idea in my head, and that was, you know, took his story down fine. So we came to act the stories out, and actually didn't see a bus at all. He was driving the bus. So he was there, you know, driving his bus and going around, and then he, you know, he gestured to some children and so on. So this whole story, you know, and I thought, oh, you know, it's the very thing I'm talking about, trying to sort of break down. It just, you know, it's just there. So that's one thing. And the other thing was about just the confidence of some of our shy and quiet children. So children you wouldn't naturally think would, you know, children you would think would shy away from an activity like this. But actually for them to initiate telling their story, and for them to actually get up on the stage and delight in performing and, you know, just showing a different side to themselves, that's been a a lovely surprise, actually, to see some children really coming out of their shell and actually, you know, becoming more of a socially becoming more of a part of their setting as well. And what was the other question, Lee, please?
The other one was about people's experience in the audience and of listening.
Okay, so the children are very, you know, like I described earlier, there would be a really big sort of hush, you know, they would just wait patiently. Even some of our children who would find it very hard to sit down for longer than, you know, 3 minutes. Even some of our children who you know, were deemed to be at an earlier stage of development in their attention and listening than expected. They would listen and they would look, and there would be parts of the stories where the practitioner can encourage all the children to join in. So, for example, if there is a story that's just got the one character and it's a little bit repetitive, maybe there's an opportunity for the practitioner to say, for example, if somebody, a child's story says, you know, and then I brush my teeth. So, okay, let's all brush our teeth, and the children could all take part. So although they're sitting around the stage, there are plenty of opportunities for children to engage in, you know, making sounds of cars or, you know, actions and so on. So that's nice for the audience. And also to you know, they all claps after every story, everybody claps, thank you. And yeah, I think that was in terms of the audience participation, that was a nice bit to the approach as well. I hope that answers the question.
That's perfect. Listen, we're just at the end of the session, so I'm not going to invite anyone to do the final question, because that normally turns into the biggest, most complicated one of the evening. So thank you very much, GORANA, for spending your time preparing that beautiful presentation and for sharing your thoughts with that. Some good links going on in the chat for people who've got other kind of things that have inspired them to practice. And it's great to end with some practical places to go for people that want to move on in their own practice with this. So thanks very much for raising our thoughts and thinking rigorously about research and bringing us back down to practice so we can think about how this applies as well. I'll let you all know when the video's up, but silent round of applause.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you as well. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Bye.